So I have read a little further in this book, Atland by Olaus Rudbeck, written in 1677. And wanted to add a few things about the calendar. Why he has noted that these northerly places are special for deriving the calendar, or for seeing from day to day how the sun appears after the days of darkness. He explains that if you go down to Italy or more southerly places, there is hardly any noticeable difference from day to day, whereas up here you quite clearly see from day to day when the sun appears on the mountain, and then the 3 to 5 days until it appears down where the people live. Okay, so this is another explanation of this, why people up here would have, I guess, learned to know about the passage of time and how to calculate it. The next chapter, chapter 6, he describes the land, and which has rocks and sand and gravel and silt and clay, and on top of this you have matjord, or what you call svartmylla eller matjord, which is the black, very fertile soil on top. And he is using this for calculating the time that has passed since the flood. And he has done, he has always got his stick with him wherever he goes, where he can measure the depth of this black soil and how it differs on the slopes from the flat land and on the open land to the forest. And I think his conclusion is that on untouched land it is 9/10 of a foot, or maybe 9/10 of a quarter of a foot. I'm not quite sure, but I might go into this a little further. It's very many pages, and I've read the whole thing. And basically he makes calculations saying that the flood took place some 3,800 to 4,000 years ago, and this was in the late 1600s. So now it would be another 300 years plus, 350 years since his calculations. So that would bring us up to 4,100 to 4,300 around that time. The big flood would have happened. And he also is looking at the depth of this black soil on top of our old ättebackar, which is where we have buried our ancestors. And these kingly grey ancestral, they're like rounded hills, have a discover that give them an age corresponding to around 800 to 1,000 years, I think he's claiming here. I might come back to this. And he's talking about different historians who are also mentioning the depth of this soil in the 1400s, for example. But he will come to this almost 4,000 years ago. At his time, the flood would have happened, and it means 4,300 around now. And then he will talk about age of Sweden according to the old texts. And Ortelius, Ferrarius, but then he will end up with Platone. And he goes into depth with Plato's writing, and Plato describes Atland or Atlantica, and the size of Atland is 5,000 stadiums, I don't know, and that corresponds to 10 degrees. And Plato says that Atland is larger than Asia and Libya, but then he refers to other old texts which define Asia as a tract of land on the east side of the Mediterranean, between certain latitudes that show that Asia is about 9 degrees latitude from south to north, and Libya is also somewhere 8 to 9 degrees from south to north. And this Atland is larger. It's actually 10 degrees, he says. And he's arguing that this, because some people claim Atland is America, but he says it can't be America because America is larger than that. And also Plato describes how people from Atland came with a fleet to conquer the rest of Europe, and he believes that it would be too much of an undertaking to bring such a large fleet all the way from America to Europe. So basically he claims that the land that Plato describes as Atland or Atlantica is Scandinavia, Sweden and Norway. He also describes this oblongated land as square and oblong. And then he will refer to another text in which Sweden is described as square, in the same way as Plato describes Atland or Atlantica. And if I find the name of this text, it's Ericus Olai in his first book about the Swedes and their actions. He describes the country in the same way. This rike is... Nej, detta riket är alldeles fyrhörnat. This means this country is altogether four-cornered. I guess I see one corner, the very south Skåne, and then further west, maybe all the way towards Norway, and then we have all the way the north of Norway, and then to Bottenviken at the north of Sweden, which they called also Kimmerland or Nordkap. I alla fall. And then he also describes this Bottenviken and how it's called in different languages and from different authors, old authors like Tunis, Jacobsen, Wagner, Johan von Loon, Gustav Adolf, something dedicated to Gustav Adolf, and Olaus Magnus, and then the European writers Fiones, Svivones, Thesaurus, Lingua Latine, and Aristoteles. And they call Bottenviken is the top of the Baltic Sea, and they in this Tunis Jacobsen, he calls it Bodem, and then Bodicus, Pontus, Bodem, Bodia, Botner, Bonten, Golfe de Botnie, Pjonten, Pjunten, Pienten, Pjonten, Potten, Botten, Botten, Pontus, Pontus, Amnis, Apud Skytas. That's Aristoteles. Okay, so there are plenty of indications in Plato's writings which correspond to Sweden, and also he describes the land as high. And now Olaus goes through all the rivers of Europe, all the rivers, and said how long all those rivers are, and even the Indus rivers and the African rivers and the American rivers, Spain or Russia, and all those rivers are long, whereas Plato describes these rivers as no longer than 10 to 20 miles, and this corresponds to the fjords of Norway, which just go a few, like 6 mil or 10 mil into the country, and then there will be a waterfall, or you can't sail further up. And even in Sweden, on our rivers, before they put sluice gates in, you couldn't sail further up than 5-6 mil or so. So this is because of the height of our land. So this is another indication. And then he also talks about the skärgård, utomskärs, inomskärs, how in the Nordic Edda saga is described how the goddess took an ox and a plow, and they plowed the land, and they got these very deep scratches, and out towards the sea you get these islands everywhere, and this is described in Plato. These skär, which is cuts or graves, and he describes how they are larger in towards the land and smaller, and plentiful. And this kind of archipelago that we find between Sweden and Finland is quite unique. You can't find anything like it anywhere else in the world. And this is where I have, as far as I have read now. So I'll come back a little later. Thank you.